Okay, thanks. I saw Mike, and I think we are opening up the discussion more generally, but Mike had a question for clarification. Oh, and you too? Sorry, Mike. Can Park Young go first? Yeah.
It's the same discussion, actually, so sorry. Is there a moral difference between, I guess, research and evaluation? Because in my mind, they're both trying to generate generalizable information. And maybe there's a problem with the definition of research. And maybe we need to rethink how we define what has to be reviewed by an ethics committee. Because I think this distinction is really strange nowadays when all data that we collect, whether passively or actively, will be used as part of research if you bother to look at it properly and analyze it. So that's my comment rather than...
Okay. Do you want to add or just take it as a comment?
In my mind, I think from an earlier understanding, because I was involved in earlier days when I started involved in the drug trial. So the research would be more of when you don't know if the drug which you are investigating is going to be effective or not. And then here the situation is where we know that this, in our case at least, that, or even in Carla's case, like the intervention which we are doing is known to be effective. Then I think there is a little difference between the research and the evaluation in my understanding.
Thanks. Mike?
I think in a way Pei Kyung already covered most of my point, but I think there would be worth value having a wider discussion about generalizable or...
Okay. I don't know who was first, but for pragmatic reasons...
Maybe, should I just finish? Then maybe it might start that off. So I think it's so much is hanging on generalizable here, what counts as generalizable. And if we thought perhaps slightly more broadly about systematically gathered, rigorously designed production of understanding, as it were, and then try to work out what kind of category you should put it in. I think we place so much weight on the idea of generalizable that actually causes as many problems as it solves here.
The man, yeah, please.
I wanted to mention, make a comment on the presentation. More so, looking at you clustered your villages. Then after doing the cluster randomization, you are telling us that the intervention goes to the last cluster last, which makes me wonder why is this? Because you've done your studies, you've received your results, and probably whatever you are researching on is effective. Why should we again do stepwise kind of intervention that the first cluster gets receives intervention first and the last cluster receives intervention last? I'm not so comfortable in that. And the other thing I noticed was that you also use politics to cluster your villages. And a politician will prefer his constituents or her constituents to be used first, because probably they understand more. I believe a politician is somebody, probably a literate person, who will understand that this intervention will be what? Will be very beneficial to my constituents. So they'll try as much as possible to influence such an intervention to come to their constituents first. As a researcher, I feel that's not ethical, if I could call it. And so maybe you can comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, or both.
I think regarding the first question, what we are trying to do is evaluating or testing here the effectiveness of these techniques at a large scale and when delivered at a very community level by these volunteers. So definitely the measurement is of the effectiveness. The efficacy has already been proven for these techniques, but we are measuring the effectiveness. And again, from a logistical perspective, doing this cluster-wise or step-wise always makes more sense from a resource perspective, from a funding perspective. from human resources used as well as the training. So there are a lot of implementation issues here where the step-wise design actually makes more sense. And as I also said, there is a lot of learning when we go in implementation. There are many practical issues which comes. There are huge barriers when we are rolling out the public health implementations. And then again, if that learning is incorporated, then I think we are refining our implementation more and more as we go. In comparison, when we are doing it at parallel at a go, then definitely there is no chance of improvement. So I think that is how I'm trying to justify the step-wise design, in my opinion. To take your second question, I completely understand it is not ethical to have an involvement of politician, but practicality is, that is the truth. Because if we are going to have a collaboration with the government without a politician or without, let's say, the minister or a politician from the regional areas, it's very difficult to roll out a community interventions because the interference of politicians are there. They are dominant figures in those areas. Communities listen to them and they have chosen them. So I think avoiding politicians completely, in my opinion, from implementation point of view is very difficult. So I understand it's not ethical. Obviously, it's driven by some politician, but I think the issue is practical also here, which needs to be discussed. Again, I'm not...
Okay. Carla, do you want to respond as well?
So in answer to the second question first, whenever I'm helping people with their stepped wedge cluster randomized controlled trials, I'm often confronted with this issue that one particular cluster must go first in the sequence. And that can be for a variety of reasons, perhaps because it's the local hospital, so it's going to be logistically easier to set up this intervention somewhere local, or perhaps because a cluster is perhaps thought to be at more greater need of this intervention. So there are various reasons why that can happen. And I think sometimes it's just necessary to go with the investigators and to do what they think is best, really. But actually, then in my mind, that becomes a quasi-randomized study and is perhaps lower on the hierarchy. And I'd perhaps suggest a subgroup analysis, and our primary analysis would be only of those clusters that were truly randomized to the order, and we would ignore the data from that first cluster in our primary analysis. Then the second question on the sort of the definition and the notion that if something is going to be, is going to generate some generalizable knowledge, is this therefore the definition that we used to say that something is therefore research? And I personally find that a very difficult definition to use, because if we think of something like a systematic review, that's trying to give us some generalizable knowledge, but we wouldn't necessarily go to an ethics board to get approvals for that type of study design. So one of the things that I had thought was that maybe a sufficient condition for research to go to an ethics board was that it was using randomization. But actually then we get to these types of policy rollouts where actually this policy was going to be rolled out anyway, and we're just randomizing the order. So is that research? But I think those types of studies are few and far between. So I was thinking that it may be a good starting point to think of anything that we randomize as being research.
Thanks,
As a
Carla.
suggestion.
Paul was first.
Yes, I will start off by addressing the issues around randomizing. I think once you involve the community leaders in choosing the ordering, then you are also removing the role of chance in playing its role in research. And let me emphasize that there is also a way of involving the politicians and the policymakers in the randomization process itself. We've had a study in which the chiefs were actually involved in picking the numbers, so that was actually randomizing. So they were actually aware of why it is that the communities were actually being randomized. And by the way, it's still okay for you to remove the error, so that it's not a randomized trial. It still remains a research by having a cluster trial, which is not randomized, although there are also some weaknesses in that particular design. But I want to emphasize also that I liked the colleague who presented on the mental health study, in that you gave justifications in terms of why you are choosing this particular design for me as a reviewer and also as a member of the Research Ethics Committee, I'm looking at those justifications that you are providing so that at the end of the day, I make my decision with regards to whether to recommend approval of your study or not. So it's very, very important for the researcher to justify the reasons why they are choosing this. There are all these important issues about logistics. It's known. This is why we talk about low income countries which do not have the resources to implement these interventions countrywide. So we're looking at implementation of a program, but implementing that program is also a learning experience, and we're actually improving the implementation as we are proceeding, and we're documenting the processes for the future, so that at the end, by the time we reach the end, we now have something which is closer to perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
So, to answer your first question, I think I completely agree regarding or agree with your comment about politicians or involving the administrator. Now, in our study, we have a kind of a collaboration with the government for a simple sense. For having this kind of a large-scale study, we cannot keep out the government, which is, I think, the important stakeholders, policyholders, or be it a politician. Secondly, this also came as a surprise in our first meeting when we had with the administrator and politician. Both of them actually suggested that we should start from this area. Now again, saying no to that becomes quite a difficult when we are going to actually the communities and start something which is mental health, which is, I think, already stigmatized. There is a lot of misunderstanding in the people's mind, and it's a quite sensitive issue at a community level. So I think that refusal, even if it's not correct, but it becomes impossible in a practical sense. So that is our problem from our end. Second issue about, yes, we already justified, I think, this study design to ethics committee, and we got ethics approval from our institutional review board. The other issues, I think, what he said, I partly agree, that justification has to be given upfront. Ethics review board should give, I think, permission accordingly, as well as we are documenting the processes. So what are learnings we are going to have in our trial, we are definitely doing the process documentation.
Joe.
Thank you. I have a comment and then a question. The comment relates to this discussion about what is research and what is quality improvement and so on. And I think we need to make clear to separate out the regulatory question and the ethics question. Right? There's a regulatory question that often comes up because specific types of research, human subjects research, often then have to go through ethics review, whereas other ways of generating knowledge maybe don't. So we have to understand what the regulations are, and we have to decide then whether something needs to go through ethics review. But there's a second ethical question, which I take it these comments are speaking to, which is when we think some sort of independent review is justified. And there I don't think we should be thinking about was the randomization or is the generalizable knowledge. I think we need to go back to why, in the first place, we thought having some sort of independent review was a good idea. And that's because, for example, we're putting individuals at risk in order to do things that are not primarily intended to benefit those individuals. It seems to me we need to go back to those reasons to work out whether or not we should have some sort of rigorous independent review. Okay, so that's the comment. And then the question is just for the mental health study in Gujarat, what was the plan with regards to the data that was collected in the study in terms of how it would feed back to the government? Suppose, following on the gentleman's point earlier, suppose it was discovered that this actually was not effective at all. Were they planning to then no longer provide this mental health care in the community? Or was it a done deal?
Silent. Shall I?
Sorry, yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, so from an effectiveness perspective, if I get your question right, then right now the collaboration with government is not like a done deal. So obviously we are going to back to the government, showing the effectiveness in mainly improving the access to care, which is like a complementary to the public health system. Then we are going to give the data on the disability reduction, then the usage of social benefits, how it improves reduction in disability as well as improving the social participation, and partly the economic status of the family or a person. Then we are also doing the cost effectiveness for this study. So we are going to show it to government that if the investment it's called as a return on investment logic, where you invest $1 and how much dollar you get in a return, not in a real dollar sense, but in a reduction of disability, improvement in productivity, and the larger goal actually is reduction in poverty, because mental health is linked with the poverty, and again it's one of the SDG. So we are kind of targeting that kind of a data to be analyzed and the results, and then we are going back to the government. So obviously it's not a done deal. So government can anytime back out and say, we are not going to do anything. They have a district mental health program, which is already there. But again, which is more of a health center based. It's not a large area of district mental health program is not community based. So what we are doing is actually, it's like a supply and demand. So we are actually doing a community intervention, which will feed into the mental health program.
Okay, Carla?
Thanks. I want to push on something that many of the people that commented before me have. So often when we talk about justifications for novel trial designs, we invoke reasons of feasibility. We opt for these trial designs because they're more feasible. And what I found interesting is that in the discussion before, it was not the feasibility of the trial, but the feasibility of the public health intervention, what was invoked. Namely, we cannot roll out this everywhere at the same time. So we need to start somewhere. And so it's interesting, that type of justification is interesting, and also is real interesting because it seems that he said just, well, since we cannot do it in all places at the same time, that sort of like opens up some space for research. So, and that's why we do the research. But then you wonder, what is the motivation for that study in the first place? And in the recent answer that I was giving suggests that it's really internal to the group that was benefiting from the study in the first place. I was wondering to what extent the idea was that it would benefit, for example, other countries considering implementing a similar intervention.
Thanks.
I think that generally the reason to do a stepped wedge trial is a choice between that an intervention is going to be evaluated, and then once a decision has been made that an intervention will be evaluated, then the decision has to be made between whether it will be a stepped wedge trial or whether it's going to be a conventional parallel cluster randomized control trial. So I think usually the decision is flipped the other way, and actually the intervention is going to be evaluated, but it's a choice between study design X or study design Y. And then often the stepped wedge trial trumps the parallel because it has this nice feature that you can roll out this intervention sequentially, and that helps logistically. But actually, many people forget that actually you can do a staggered parallel type of trial where you can have phases of rollout of the intervention. So if really the only reason why you're choosing a stepped wedge trial is because you cannot roll this intervention out simultaneously to all clusters, then that's not a good reason to be choosing the stepped wedge trial, because you can do a parallel trial having a staggered or phased rollout as well.
Thanks for clarifying. I have room for 2 more questions, so you are first and you second.
Great, thanks for great presentations and really 2 very good case studies for this discussion. I was just going to make a couple of comments, and one is that a common distinction is to focus on the primary purpose for the activity. So if it's really primarily about generalizing, about providing new generalizable knowledge, that would be considered research, where if it's primarily a program evaluation, which may also incidentally provide useful information, generalizable information, then that would not be considered research. So I think whether or not something produces generalizable knowledge isn't the key factor. It's what the primary purpose for the activity was. And if you are implementing a program, I think it's ethically imperative to rigorously evaluate it and to share that information. So whether or not something's published, I don't think really is primary as to whether it's considered research or not. And then the other comment is just around the concept of withholding or delaying. And I think in the vaccine example that was given, if in the areas that are getting the vaccine later, if you're going around actively blocking people from accessing vaccine in the private sector, for example, that would, I think, fairly clearly be unethical withholding. Whereas if you just only have so many resources in cold chain and vaccine and trainers, and you're rolling it out sequentially, that's a very different situation. Thanks.
Okay.
I also perhaps agree that the concept of having something publishable does not necessarily mean that therefore is generalizable. But I think we also have to be careful that researchers don't use this study design as an easy way of not getting these research ethics approvals because they can claim that actually it's not generalizable. And another person raised the point that actually we should go to the regulations and see what the regulations say. But actually the regulations don't say anything about the stepped wedge cluster randomized control trial. And in the UK, we have some research ethics boards that will approve and will look at these types of studies. And so the people and the clusters participating in those trials have gone under review of a research ethics board. Yet in another part of the country, if a similar trial is submitted to a research ethics board, they will say, actually, this isn't research. So I think sometimes it might be good to have some very clear guidance for research ethics committee so as they can determine whether or not they should be reviewing these types of trials, because at the moment it's a completely mixed picture.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for the presentations. I'm wondering that for evaluating the success of an intervention, how do you manage the confounding effect of the time of exposure if each cluster receives a different time, and particularly those that are enrolled at the last moment? How can you manage if you have, for example, 6 clusters, each received the intervention for a different time frame?
So that's a real problem in the stepped wedge trial. There is a delay in the rollout, and there can be temporal effects. And the only way to allow for that is making sure that the primary analysis is adjusted for time. And so recommendations are that anyone who reports a stepped wedge trial, their primary estimate must be adjusted for time. And I think methodologists appreciate that. But there have been examples of stepped wedge trials published in the BMJ and also in PLOS Medicine within the past couple of years where the primary analysis was not adjusted for time. And I think this then brings us to the next question of where about in the hierarchy these trials should sit, because they do rely on adjustment for time, whereas the parallel design and the individually randomized control trial do not rely on us adjusting for those time effects.
Thanks, Carla. Just last question. Yeah.
Yes, let me preface my remarks with 2 statements. One, when I see the phrase, is delay in care consistent with clinical equipoise, I think we're venturing into the therapeutic misconception, and I attach that comment with the concept that what is the primary justification for doing the activity? And I think we're using the word research to do too much work. Consistent with what Joe said, that if it's not research, that's okay. We'll have another committee review the activity to make sure whether the activity justifies the, the risks, the potential risks to the participants and to determine whether that justification is enough to do the activity while exposing participants to a delay in care. So I think we need to separate research from quality assurance issues, and that's okay, because as long as you have a good enough reason to do the activity, and it may not be research activity, but as long as you have a justifiable reason to do the activity, then it may be justifiable to delay care.
Okay, thanks.
So I agree with your points. In our case, I think we, as I said, we had taken a approval from Ethics Review Board, Institutional Review Board, and we are every 6 months or annually we are giving them the report. Secondly, as you are saying about the quality assurance, so we have an advisory board, again not a DSMB, but we have an advisory board who is looking at our implementation, the quality of the implementation and how we can improve, or how actually the harm is not happened to the participants. So advisory board meets every 6 months and kind of a review our implementation, and if harm is not, there is a no harm.
Unnecessary harm. Yeah. Unnecessary.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. We will now. Well, thank you all for the interesting, very interesting and stimulating discussion. We will now go and continue discussion in the breakout groups and go to our breakout groups. But just before we do that, there are vouchers for lunch right around the corner outside of this room. You can catch those vouchers now or just after your breakout groups, and then there's lunch.